Chapter 8 Unseen Visitors. William Tyndale started outside, but Colin clung to him. "Oh, Sir William, don't go out there. It must be one of Cardinal Wolsey's spies. Look at his sword. He'll kill us." "I shall not leave my manuscript out there," Tyndale said. The landlady clutched at Tyndale's cloak. "I don't know what this all means, but you saved my daughter's life. Go hide in the stable. I'll take care of this man." Tyndale shook himself free. "My manuscript is worth more than my life." The landlady pointed to a scullion's smock hanging near the fireplace. They had at least put on this smock. "I have a chicken ready for the spit. You can turn it and hear for yourself what the man intends to do. I'll get your manuscript myself." Tyndale slipped into the smock and began to twirl the spit with frenzied speed. "Not too fast," the landlady warned in a whisper. She handed Colin some clean linens. "Set the table there by the window. I'll have the groom bring the papers and books into the kitchen." She whisked out the back way. The tall stranger entered, and it seemed to Colin that the man filled the doorway. Colin was baffled by the kind, earnest look on the plump face. Somehow, this person did not look like a swordsman. The stranger in red sat down by the window and laid the book on the table. "Who owns Martin Luther's New Testament?" he asked Colin. Colin could not keep his gaze off the sword. He smoothed the tablecloth, fighting waves of terror. His hands shook and his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Someone came earlier on horseback," he said, jerking out the words. "He'll be back later." The stranger's face fell. "I very want to meet the man who travels with this book." He glanced toward the fireplace. "Is that chicken ready to eat?" William Tyndale hunched over and spun the spit faster than before. "I don't know. The landlady will be right back, sir," Colin said. The landlady hurried in, curtsying and apologizing. When the chicken was ready, William Tyndale unhooked the spit with such awkwardness that the chicken fell onto the hot coals. The landlady was at his side in one jump. She shook her fist in Tyndale's face. "You clumsy oaf! Back to the kitchen with you!" She pushed him out of the dining room, beckoning Colin to follow. In the kitchen, Tyndale slumped on a high stool. "I'll pay for the chicken," he said in humble tones. "You'll do nothing of the sort," the landlady said kindly. "I just scolded you in order to get you out of the dining room. Here are your books and papers." She pointed towards a neat pile on the table. Tyndale leafed through the papers with intent eagerness. "They're all here," he said, smiling. "I would hate to do all this work over again." He rested one hand on the manuscript. "I think the boy and I had better go on a little farther tonight. We'll pay you for a night's lodging anyway, because of all the trouble you've had on my account." The landlady's eyes filled with tears. Colin saw that she had not forgotten for a moment what Tyndale had done for her daughter. "Indeed, you'll not pay a cent. I can put you in a back room, and you can be on your way by the first streak of dawn, and no one the wiser." A booming voice from the doorway made all of them jump. "Is there some trouble in this house?" The stranger in red came straight toward the book-laden table. With a look of puzzlement and curiosity, he stared at Tyndale. "Perhaps the book I brought inside belongs here too," he said. "Yes, it does." There was defiance in Tyndale's voice, and Colin's muscles tensed. Why was the stranger so insistent? I perceive by your accent that you are from England, the stranger said. Perhaps you could tell me, is the name Martin Luther well known in that country? Colin saw a slight tremor in Tyndale's hands. He knew well that Tyndale was tempted to talk. His name is a household word, Tyndale admitted. The stranger beamed. Then a shadow crossed his plump face. In what way do you mean? What do people think of Luther there? Tyndale hesitated. Colin clenched his fists, hoping Tyndale would not talk too much. There are many opinions about Martin Luther, Tyndale said. Some can't praise him enough. Some, particularly the clergy, damn him as a heretic. The stranger grunted, then straightened up and spoke in an excited manner. Should any cry out that Luther is a heretic, I am certain he cares but little for their clamors. Such men as accuse him have never tasted the Bible, but Luther has cleared the stumps and stones out of the way so that others may read the Scriptures without hindrance. Do you by any chance know Luther? Tyndale asked. I'm hoping to meet him in Wittenberg. The stranger in red hesitated. Redden clenched his fists and then laughed aloud. You have already met him, he said, bowing. You mean you're Martin Luther himself? Colin breathed the words in such disbelief, wonderment, and shock that both men laughed. The two men began to talk at the same time. They laughed, excused themselves, and started again. Their words poured out in a flood of excited exchange. When Tyndale spoke of translating the Bible into English, Martin Luther leaned toward him and waggled a finger in warning. Translating is not everybody's gift. It demands a pious, true, industrious Christian, learned, experienced, and practiced heart. Tyndale bowed his head humbly. I found it a laborious task to force Hebrew writers to talk German. Martin Luther went on. It was as if a nightingale had to give up its own sweet melody and imitate the song of the cuckoo. Tyndale agreed. Many have told me the English tongue is too clumsy, he said, but I always ask them, has not God made the English tongue as well as others? Martin Luther chuckled. Yes, but be sure you do not get your English from the Latin. You must get it from the mother in the house, the child in the street, and the common man in the marketplace. Tyndale's face became sad. But I am exiled from England. I shall never again hear the English mother, the English child, or the English laborer. The wistfulness in his voice brought a lump of sympathy to Colin's throat. Martin Luther was silent for a moment. If this work be of God, nothing on earth will stop it. The men must have talked the night away. The next thing Colin knew, Tyndale was shaking him by the shoulder and urging him to dress. Colin was bewildered. He could not remember even going to bed. Martin Luther has gone on alone, Tyndale told Colin. He agrees that we must keep in hiding, even though Wittenberg is liberal in its religious views. A few hours later, Colin and Tyndale dismounted at the city gates of Wittenberg and led their horses to the deputy in charge. What is your business here? The deputy asked. Student at the university. The deputy motioned them through. Ahead, not far from the gates, a group of townspeople had gathered, watching the entrance. Their stares made Colin uncomfortable. Do they know you're coming? He whispered to William Tyndale. What are they waiting for? 3 horsemen galloped in and dismounted. A man dressed in black with a long gold chain around his neck pushed his way past Colin and Tyndale. The deputy at the gate bowed and bawled out in loud tones, "The grace of God and of the Holy Father is at our gates." A crowd of people surged forward. Some held up lighted tapers, others beat drums, still others rang bells. A carriage entered the arched gateway and drew up beside the three horsemen. One of the riders opened the carriage door. A man in brown robes stepped out, bearing before him a blue velvet cushion with a scroll fastened on cloth of gold. Murmurs of awe came from the townspeople. Colin, too, exclaimed, and William Tyndale groaned. There was no mistaking the tall, awkward figure of William Roy. Roy glanced at them, paled, and hurried toward the sound of blowing horns. A glimmer of understanding came to Colin. "He's selling relics again, isn't he, Sir William?" They watched a second man step out of the carriage, holding a large wooden cross in front of him. "He's got a partner," Colin whispered. He and Tyndale followed the procession to the market square and listened to Roy hug on the people. "Good folk, do not crowd so much," Roy said. "Make way for those who have money. We will afterward endeavor to satisfy those who have none." Tyndale whispered to Colin. His tongue not only would make fools go mad, but also would deceive the wisest at first sight and acquaintance of him. "Here is the comb of the cock that crowed at the house of Pilate," Roy called out. "And here is a piece of planking from Noah's Ark. I have the very pebble David used to slay the giant Goliath. Don't crowd, good folk. There is enough for all." Tyndale drew Colin past the jostling crowd, who were eager to buy the precious relics. "We must find a place to live. Then we can come back." Colin looked back over his shoulder. It would be easy to find Roy again, as long as he had something to sell. A few blocks away, Tyndale stopped at a three-story house, where a woman stood in the doorway. Colin could see a disdainful frown on her face. "You have not joined the procession today?" William Tyndale asked. The woman crossed her arms and sniffed. "Ridiculous! As if paying for a relic blessed by the Pope is enough to save one's soul." "Perhaps Martin Luther's ideas suit you better," Tyndale asked. "They certainly do. Because of him, the New Testament has been opened to me and many others. But I see you have not joined the crowd either, and I can tell by your accent that you are not a native of Wittenberg." It did not take much further talk before Tyndale and the housewife came to an understanding about lodgings. In a short time, Colin and Tyndale were at home on the top floor. "You'll be safe here," the woman said, proud and respectful. "I have strong bolts on my doors." With living arrangements settled, Colin went back to the market square with William Tyndale. A crowd of people circled Roy. This time he was shouting protests to two officers. "These relics are genuine. They have been blessed by the Pope himself." He looked around with a wild look. "My partners will tell you so." The officers shook their heads. They lodged the complaint themselves before leaving town. Roy appeared to digest the news. "But I am in holy orders," he said. "I cannot be arrested." "We know about that, too," an officer said, pulling back Roy's robe. A checkered doublet of green and white showed underneath. "But I can prove it." Roy was breathing hard. "I know the first verse of the 51st Psalm. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness. According unto the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgression." Colin saw the officers hesitate. Perhaps we should hand him over to the spiritual courts, one said. Roy pranced in anguish. No, no, set me free. You will bring great trouble to yourself otherwise. The officers hesitated. Do you know anyone who can speak for you? Once again, Roy looked around wildly. Colin saw Roy's expression change when he discovered William Tyndale. Yes, yes, there's a man who can speak for me. He's a famous scholar from England. Save me, Sir William. I'm an honest. Here Roy choked and started again. Well, I'm a well deserving friend of yours. Everyone turned and stared at William Tyndale. It seemed to Colin that every glance stabbed, probed, and questioned. Who was this famous man from England? Everyone seemed to be asking. What was he doing in Wittenberg? Colin knew people would discuss the incident. Already the secrecy Tyndale needed so desperately was gone. Tyndale walked up to the officers and whispered something Colin could not hear. The effect was immediate. With bows and murmurs, the officers handed Roy over to Tyndale. With a final bow, the officers pushed through the crowd and hurried up the streets. The onlookers, disappointed, drifted away. Colin sighed. Tyndale spoke to Roy in a firm voice. I mentioned Martin Luther's name, and that is why the officers freed you. We won't discuss what you have done. I need someone to help me compare the text for my Bible translation. If you work with me, I will pay you the salary I promised. At the mention of money, Roy's eyes gleamed. Of course, of course. He shuffled his long feet. I'll help you in every way I can. In the months that followed, Colin had to admit that Roy was an excellent assistant for Tyndale, but the ex-monk also loved to bring back the news and gossip of the day. Did you hear? He asked one afternoon after returning with a supply of paper. One of Luther's students was murdered for his heretical views. Only a short time ago, he was sitting here at Luther's feet. Colin listened with uneasy interest. Roy was such a gossip, one could never tell when he was telling the truth and when he was exaggerating. Tyndale did not look up from his manuscript. And did you know that Luther's New Testament was denounced as a foul thing and burned? Roy leaned forward, as if expecting Tyndale to show strong emotion. But Tyndale did not speak. And that isn't all. Roy bounced with eagerness. They do say that certain men are going to put Luther in prison. He'll be kept, a kind of free prisoner. And they do say, Tyndale clapped both hands to his ears, spare me any further news. I want to think only of my translation. It is almost finished. The day came when Colin saw Tyndale lay his pen down and smile. The New Testament was translated and ready to be printed, but first it must be shown to Martin Luther. Later, at the roomy cloister where Luther lived, Colin, Tyndale, and Roy were ushered into Luther's study. Luther himself, dressed in a dark professor's gown, greeted them heartily. Amidst a jumble of books and papers scattered on chairs, tables, and bookcases, Colin sensed the deep emotion both Tyndale and Luther tried to hide when the manuscript of the New Testament in English was laid on the table. For once, Roy remained silent. Luther fingered the pages with solemn respect. With the help of God, you have accomplished for the English people what God permitted me to do for Germany. Where do you plan to have the New Testament printed? Not here in Wittenberg, I hope. You don't think it would be wise? Tyndale asked. Luther shook his head. Go to Cologne. Find Peter Quintel. He is an excellent printer. He looked thoughtful. Have you arranged how to send the printed copies to England? The two men looked at each other and burst out laughing. Roy looked indignant. What other way is there besides smuggling? He asked. Luther and Tyndale laughed again. I shall send them in the accepted way, Tyndale said with a twinkle. I have merchant friends who will help, he added. When it was time to go, Luther gave the three his warmest blessing. On the way back to Tyndale's lodgings, Roy walked with a spring in his step, chatting about the money Tyndale would make selling copies of the New Testament. The landlady must have been watching out the window. She ran out of the house and flung herself on Tyndale. Hide! Hide! There are men upstairs. They pushed me and threatened me with swords. I don't know what they're doing up there. She wrung her hands, then pushed all three into the kitchen. Overhead, Colin could hear thumps and grunts. Men were shouting and exclaiming to each other. After a long time, a heavy tramping sound on the stairs. The front door slammed. Tyndale sprang to his feet, but the landlady would not let him go upstairs until she went out herself to see if the street was clear. A few minutes later, she ran back. The neighbors say there were only two men. One had a red beard. It's strange. I thought there were more. I didn't even notice the beard. For a second, Tyndale closed his eyes, then without a word raced upstairs. Colin and Roy followed at his heels. The door to the attic room hung on its hinges. The beds had been ripped apart, the mattresses slashed, and the filling piled into heaps. Books lay helter-skelter. The table was overturned. The chest of drawers gaped open. Near the window, Colin saw a sticky, dark mess. He called to Tyndale and Roy to look. What's that? Roy asked, poking gingerly with his foot. It took him a little while to discover that someone had torn out leaves of Luther's New Testament, crumpled them, and poured ink so carefully over the words that none could be read. Colin made another discovery, an uncrumpled sheet of white paper on which had been scrawled the words, "The English Bible shall burn."